growth in the number of refundable credits that are appearing in the tax code, and some of them are quite large. First-time homebuyer credit, for example, is enormous, and now there's an adoption credit that can go up to, I think, $13,000 or $14,000. So there are a lot of opportunities, if you will, for folks to play with the system, and our objective as we bring people in is to establish minimal competency standards and then address those folks who are not. Let me stop with that. I've seen a number of questions have, I think, come in, and you'll hear the disembodied voice asking them, but hopefully I'll be able to answer or get that information with you later. So let's start with the first question.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions and very little overlap, actually. Does employee include per diem contractors?
So if you have someone for whom you are paying to complete tax returns, then that person is a tax return preparer. I'm not sort of interested in the 20-factor test. We're not going to go there. But if that individual is preparing all or substantially all of the return, regardless of whether or not they sign it, and regardless of how they're compensated, they are return preparers and are therefore covered by these rules.
Okay, and a couple of folks have asked whether this affects vita program, volunteer tax preparers.
I was waiting for that. So sharp listener noticed that I noted that the definition of return preparer includes and only includes those who prepare returns for compensation. So the answer to the question is no, it does not apply to vita volunteers. Now, I know that will not necessarily sit well with some folks, but let me just point out a couple of things. One is we do have a regime that does look at volunteer return prep. We are audited regularly on the quality of that prep, and our most recent audit suggests the accuracy rate for those returns is in the 90s, 90%, by the way. I'm not going to say that every return done by a vita volunteer is perfectly accurate, nor will I rule out that at some point in the future we may move to impose additional requirements there. The focus, however, of this effort is on folks who prepare tax returns for money. And I think it stands to reason, even if you were ultimately going to roll out requirements for everyone who does tax returns, you might start with those who are actually charging for their services.
Okay, it's a bit of a philosophical one that says, anybody consider back to your hairdresser analogy, does anybody consider just eliminating licensure of hairdressers?
Well, you know, there is a debate about that. The most interesting one that I've heard is floral arrangement. I don't know if you know that in Louisiana it's the only state that allows, that licenses and requires people who arrange flowers to pass an exam. And all I can say about that is that the states may adopt whatever they may adopt. It's part of our beautiful federal system. But the regime that we're describing is something that has been looked at, and as I did mention, we had testimony from across the spectrum about whether we should do this, and the answer was a resounding yes.
Okay, somebody asks, I am the shareholder of a corporation. Do I alone obtain the PTIN, or must the corporation also obtain one?
The PTIN attaches to the individual, not to the corporation or the firm, depending on how you think about it. Now, I want to make a comment because one thing I didn't cover is the electronic filing mandate that was tacked onto a tax bill. Yeah, I was waiting for that. I don't know if you all, I'm sure most of you noticed the, in November, the president, I can't even remember the acronym anymore, though I was the original implementer for that legislation. But we got another tax bill that gave us 2 more homebuyer tax credits to go with the 2 we already had to give us that complete set of among the most complicated provisions I've seen in some time on the individual side. There were some net operating loss provisions, and then stuck at the end was one page that imposed an e-filing mandate on preparers who reasonably expect to file more than 10 returns in 2011. We are actually rolling that out in 2 parts, recognizing that it may impose some hardship or maybe just difficult for folks to get the word. In 2011, the requirement will be that preparers who file 100 or more returns will need to file those returns electronically. For those who file less, the threshold will drop to more than 10 in 2012. We also plan to offer waiver forms. Now, when I say that, That means that the firm may seek a waiver from the filing requirement. It will be a short-term waiver. You'll need to complete a form and explain why you're seeking the waiver, and I think we'll be flexible in that initially, but in the long run, not so much. We will also provide exemptions for individuals. So think about the waiver attaching to the firm and an exemption attaching to an individual return. Maybe it's folks like my parents who really don't want to file electronically, and so they're going to insist that they want their return filed on paper. That's okay. Or remember I mentioned the home buyer tax credits a moment ago. As you probably know, we are now requiring the provision of a HUD-1 as part of the return. Well, you can't file a HUD-1 electronically today, so you'll need to file on paper. So if the return itself can't be filed electronically, obviously the return is exempt from the e-filing mandate requirement. To file electronically, for those of you who do not already, you'll need to obtain an EFIN, an electronic filing identification number. They're available on our website. And those do attach at the firm level, and then people may be associated with them. So the PTIN attaches to the individual. It will travel with you. Again, back to my point about people paying for PTINs for their employees. If that employee leaves, so does the PTIN associated with that employee. But the EFIN stays with the firm. And I would encourage those of you who don't have them already to get one, because I suspect most of you probably will be filing more than 100 returns next year.
The question about the e-filing was specifically about a prohibition of data mining of e-filed returns.
I've been asked this several times, and I may not be communicating this right because I keep getting asked it, but let me explain. The IRS has been very clear for a very long period of time, and we have not changed on this, that the chances of your being audited do not depend on your filing method. All right? So to the extent that you file on paper, that does not in any way affect your chances of being audited. What affects your chances of being audited are the characteristics of the return. And in that context, there is information that we do glean from returns that are filed on paper or electronically. And we do data mining across the board. That enables us to improve our selection process. But it does not mean that we select based on the method of filing. It means that we select on the basis of the characteristics of the return, regardless of the method of filing. That will not change. And the e-file mandate, while it will enable us to take more data in electronically, will not cause us to change that either. So I hope that puts to rest this notion that somehow filing on paper will make it easier to avoid an exam, or harder, depending on the myth that you subscribe to. But the bottom line is, it's about the characteristics of the return and our ability to identify characteristics that suggest there are problems. So I hope that helps.
When we talk about return preparation, does that include preparation of forms 940, 941, etc.? Now, if you could be so kind as to repeat that question, because it is getting a little...
So I understand folks are having trouble hearing, so let me repeat the question. Does the return preparation mantra include 940s and 941s? That's actually a very good question to which I don't have the answer today. My general answer is probably not. Meaning, particularly to the extent that we are testing 1040 type returns, it would seem sort of inconsistent to require someone taking a 940 or not doing only payroll tax returns to test on 1040s and 1041s, on 1040s. That said, if you are doing payroll returns, you will need to do the PTIN requirement. As to the rest of the testing and CE, the answer is probably not, but you'll need to wait until I wrestle the ground a number of the folks that are still sort of up in the air on this issue before I can give you a definitive answer.
You have a question?
I have a question.
Great.
I have a question about enforcement. You're talking about folks that for compensation prepare or substantially prepare all of the return, not necessarily the signer. So how are you going to handle the enforcement of that?
So this
how are
is
you going to know who prepared the return?
So that's actually a very insightful question. It is, as I said earlier, from an administrative standpoint, it is much easier for me just to go right at the person who signed the return, or not. I mean, I'm not, if you're looking at enforcement, though, it's just the person who signed the return. When you move to saying all or substantially all, well, how do I know that? And so here is what I anticipate is the most likely outcome. If we identify a PTIN or a preparer associated with a bunch of problematic returns and we decide we want to take a look, one of the first things we would ask that person is who else was involved, what other PTINs are associated with that return. And we would conduct a broader look at who was involved in that process and how it was done. Now that doesn't mean we're necessarily going to start pulling the PTINs of those folks, but it does go to the fitness to practice. And really, truly, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at cases where there are problematic returns and lots of them, and someone is actually preparing them and charging money for them. So the presence of the PTIN on the return will give us an idea of who the signer was. If we've got questions, that's when we'll start asking more questions about who else was involved in the return. Is that easy? Probably not. It's probably a little confusing. But it does address one of the real concerns that we heard when we said it would only be the signing preparer, and that is that there are lots of folks who make substantial decisions around those returns, who exercise judgment about what is on that return and how it is characterized, and that they should be covered by what we're describing here. And so that's what we're going to be doing. It doesn't mean, I think, that I think some folks are concerned that we'll have the PTIN police going out there. And frankly, if you know anything about our enforcement resources, it's unlikely that we would be able to do that in any reasonable way. And so think more about rules of reason about how we might apply and enforce it.
Yeah, because there was somebody else was asking whether you're going to have a reporting functionality where those in compliance can report those who aren't.
Absolutely, and so that goes to, I guess, what I would call the gray market. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I actually think that's going to be the biggest challenge. It's finding folks who aren't complying. I like to refer to them as the Joe self-prepareds, or the Joe I didn't prepare. We know that there will be, I'm not sure whether they're marginal or not, because they often do hundreds, if not thousands, of returns. But there will be preparers who decide that they'll prepare the return and then pass it off to the taxpayer, who will then sign as if he or she has prepared it himself or herself. Now that is going to be tougher to get at, right? It's not as if we have a magic wand that will tell us who signed and lied. By the same token, we are actually looking at that. It turns out there are a couple things that have developed recently. We think data mining will actually help us there. We've talked to a number of companies that think they may be able to predict with some accuracy folks who fall into that category. And we may be able to actually do things like send letters to the taxpayers to say, hey, you said your return was self-prepared, but we'd like you to affirm that here. Please sign here. Or you can give us the name of the person who did prepare your tax return. And we also anticipate getting referrals. And we're going to have to let the process of enforcement and compliance evolve. It gets expensive when it takes people knocking on doors. And I think that's the traditional notion that that's how we're going to do compliance, and that's how we've done it, and we'll continue to do some of that. But when I'm bringing a group of people that may be as many as 1 million into a system, I don't have the resources, nor will I ever have the resources to be knocking on doors the way people may envision. So it's going to be a variety of techniques to improve compliance, one of which will involve taking referrals from folks like you who know of individuals or firms that aren't complying with the rules, and letting us know about them and having a strategy for addressing them.
Okay, and a few people, and again, if you could please repeat, a few people are asking whether the renewal period is going to be annual or based on the month that a preparer originally obtained a PTIN, and I'm sorry if you already answered this.
So the question was, will the fee be sort of a calendar year, or will it be based on the time frame from which the person originally obtained a PTIN? And the answer is the latter. So if you go in to our system, let's say it's October 25th, you apply for and obtain your PTIN, you will have 12 months until October 25th of next year to complete your continuing education requirements. That's how it will work. So it won't be on the calendar year basis as it is in some places today. It will attach to the time frame that coincides with your PTIN.
And how about admin staff that's entering limited information or an unpaid intern?
So the question was about administrative staff or unpaid interns. And this is where we're going to require and ask you to use your judgment about the judgment being exercised by those individuals. We make examples in the regs of people who do merely administrative functions or